Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. I'm your host, JP John Poz. With me today, very special guest, TV host, radio host, sports journalist. Of course, you will recognize him as the host of TSN's Off the Record. He is Mr. Michael Landsberg. Michael, welcome to the two-man power trip. How you doing?
Hey, John, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Always enjoy this kind of discussion, and I am looking forward to it. So let's get to her.
What is going on in your world? What have you been up to? What are you doing?
Right now, I left TSN about a year ago, and I have been really devoting myself to talking about mental health. On Off the Record, the show that I hosted in 2009, I was interviewing former New Jersey Devil, Stéphane Richer. I don't know if you're a hockey fan, but Stéphane Richer, I read just before I went to greet the guests in the green room, I read that he had battled depression in the 1990s. And I thought, I should ask him about it. It'll make for an interesting question. I had battled depression at that point for the previous decade and anxiety all my life, but I never spoke about it because I thought, who would care? Like, why would I share it? I wasn't ashamed, though. Everybody in my life knew. So I said to him, hey, Stéphane, would it be okay if I asked you about depression? And he said, I'd rather not talk about it. And I said, okay, well, I respect that. But if you'll talk about it, I'll talk about it. He asked me what I would talk about. I told him, he said, let's do it. We went on the air. We talked for maybe 2 minutes, and that changed the course of my life. I found out the impact that simply sharing your mental health battle without shame and embarrassment and without seeming weak had a huge impact on people. So I've kind of year after year done more and more of it, and now I spend all my time doing it.
Sick Not Weak, right? Is the name of,
Yeah,
was
yeah.
a hashtag originally, and then obviously the website.
Yeah, and it's our charity, Sick Not Weak Charitable Foundation. We named it that because Sick Not Weak is a statement. I mean, you could have called it Mental Health Foundation. I mean, but that doesn't really mean anything. But Sick Not Weak is kind of the way I think people need to look at it. And if we saw mental illness, like depression, for instance, as not being a weakness but a sickness, this stigma would disappear. But John, people, especially men, but people of all ages and all genders and all races and in all locations, don't want to be seen as weak. And if you perceive the illness as a weakness, you're not going to share. You're not going to get help. You're going to suffer in silence, and that doesn't lead to any place good.
When you say sick, not weak, and like you're saying, a lot of like you thinking a lot of men were thinking, oh, it's weak to mention it, or they don't want to mention it at all, or when they do mention it, they feel weak. Like, kind of just go into that a little bit more if you could.
Yeah, it's to me that's at the heart of the stigma, which is still a factor when it comes to mental health. The perception that somehow an illness like depression, in particular, is self-inflicted, that we let it happen to ourselves or we made it happen to ourselves. And as a result, we don't want to share because we have the sense of shame. And the belief that we carry around is often it's a weakness. It's not an illness like cancer or diabetes or lupus or juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. It is a weakness. And somehow it's self-inflicted. And that's why people won't share. That's why it's the only illness that I know of where people would go, if you said to them, for instance, like I know the pain of depression. If you said to someone, I don't think you're okay. Like it seems like you're not doing well, and they denied it and deny it because eventually they say, "Look, I'm not going to a doctor. I'm not going to see anyone about this." It's the only illness that people would say that about. No one would say, if you had this awful toothache, I'm not going to see a doctor. Or if you were drowning and someone threw you a life jacket, you're not going to turn it away. But when mental illness hits us, we just don't seem to be sure that it's actually an illness as opposed to a self-inflicted wound.
You think we're getting better? We're progressing a lot
Yeah,
more.
yeah. I mean, there's no doubt, but also there's no doubt because I travel around giving talks about this, and I talk to people every day about it online usually, and there's no doubt that the perception is still there. I mean, I will hear from the partner of someone who will reach out to me and say, my partner, either male or female, I mean, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but my partner is really struggling and he won't go for help. How do I convince him that he needs to go for help? And I hear that all the time. Statistically, there was a study done in Canada in 2019, so just before the pandemic, 75% of people that responded said that they would not share a mental health problem with their employer. So that stigma still exists too, that people are afraid, hey, if I share this thing, my boss is going to look at me differently. I won't get opportunities for advancement. They'll just think that I'm weak.
Which is not good. We should obviously should be above that, and our bosses forget about it. They should be above that and not look down upon us for that too. But it's a lot better than it was like maybe in the 90s, right? We're learning more and more gradually.
Yeah, it's disappointing only because so much time and effort has been spent on trying, how many charities have you heard about that use the word stigma in them? Stomp the stigma, crush the stigma, banish the stigma. There's like millions of them, and yet the stigma still seems to be a problem. And that's what we do. We got our charitable foundation licensed by the we call it Revenue Canada. You would call it the IRS, by saying our mandate is to show people that a mental illness like depression is a sickness, not a weakness. So I found that out on Off the Record one day. I wasn't trying to do anything good. I just thought I'll ask a question that will get me an interesting answer, because that's your job. And then I saw the reaction to it, and that changed my life.
So what do you do personally to battle it, live with it? Like, what are you doing for depression?
Well, I'm on medication, and I always kind of footnote that with I'm not here to be an advocate for meds. I wish I wasn't on medication. I hate being on meds, but I hate the illness more. So I have learned to love the thing I hate the least. And in this case, I hate the medication less than I hate the illness. Medication gave me my life back, maybe saved my life as well. So I am lucky to have lived in a time that medication existed, right? Doesn't work for everyone. It's not right for everyone. But what I say is that if you feel sick enough, and I know what that's like, if you have lost all joy in your life or the ability to experience joy, if your self-esteem seems to have disappeared, if you feel like you're isolated and hopeless, if you experience that, you need to make a commitment to do anything to get better. So it's like, I will fight for my happiness no matter what. And everything is on the table, whether it be meds or therapy, or now there's all kinds of new treatments that involve psychotropic drugs like ketamine, right? And like magic mushrooms. And there's deep brain stimulation and magnetic stimulation. There's things that I would do if I had a choice before I went on medication. You need to commit to the fight, because if you're sick enough with something like depression, John, you are living, but you're not really alive, because you can't feel joy. And that is a tragic way to live.
Were you just completely unhappy without joy? Like when you were talking to Stefan Richer and stuff like that, was that the first sign that you had had depression?
Oh, no, 97. We started Off the Record in 1997. And that's when immediately, it's funny, two things in my life going on. On one hand, I had this amazing opportunity after hosting SportsCenter for 5 or 6 years. I had this great opportunity to have a show with my name on it, right? And to basically, do anything in that half hour that we were given. And we created this show called Off the Record, where we could put anybody on that we thought you would be interested in hearing from. Didn't just have to be people tied to sports, didn't have to just be players or coaches or general managers. We put on musicians of all kinds. We put on actors. We put on politicians. So especially music. We had I guess he was Puff Daddy back then. We had Pink on the show. Like what a cool job that was. We had Spike Lee on the show. We had Vin Diesel on the show. Like here I am sitting with these people, and I'm going, wow, this is amazing. Not only do I get to experience them for a short period of time, but I get to control the environment. Like I thought it was really cool, especially with directors that we had on the show, like Spike Lee. Like I'm saying, okay, Spike, here's the way we do the show. And when I ask the first question, I'm going to ask who wants to answer it first, and then I'll look at you and you jump right in. I thought, that was really cool. So I had this great job, But over about an 8-month period, John, I started to battle something that I didn't even know I was battling. I try to, when I talk about this, I try to give people the benefit of my experience, which can make a difference to their experience. And what I found was I had battled depression for probably 8 months before I came to the conclusion that I was in need of some kind of treatment, because it can happen so slowly. It can happen like to the point where you don't notice it's happening. These tiny, tiny, tiny changes in us that add up to a big change. And for me, it was this realization one day when I turned down an offer to do something really fun. I thought, why did I do that? And then I started to think back to the previous 6 months or 8 months. And I realized I had started really to retreat from life. And the person that I was, I no longer was. And the person that I became, I did not want to be. And that was kind of like this awakening for me, where the next day I talked my way into a psychiatrist's office. And that was kind of the first step for me in the road back.
You said 1997 is kind of like the start of Off the Record. So you figured you're like on top of the world at that point.
Yes.
So that's got to be a internal struggle too. It's like, that's weird. Like, best thing going for me, I'm not feeling like it.
Yeah, and that's a great question, John, that I hear all the time because of, as I said, the conversations that I have, because I don't know what my role in the mental health world is. I guess I'm a mental health advocate. And I hear all the time from people that will say, I'm so ashamed that I feel depressed because I have so many great things in my life. And that's typical of what people think. I fortunately did not think that, but people believe that, right? So they don't believe that they're entitled to help because they don't believe that they're necessarily sick with something. They think that somehow they've rejected the good things in their life and have fallen into this depressive hole, which they won't ask for treatment to get out of because they feel like it was their fault they're in the hole.
Do you think that a lot of people also think like, oh, you're just having a bad day, you'll get over it? Like, do they have
For
that
sure.
aspect too?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the stigma, right? And I never got offended by anything I heard from people. And I, to this day, have never once been offended by anything anyone has said to me when it comes to mental health. Why would I care about somebody else's opinion? And I was fortunate that my family understood, my employer understood, and that's all I really needed. But there's things that people say that are really hurtful to other people. Like, when you say something like, "Oh, it's just a bad day," or "Oh, we all go through it." I mean, that I hate that. We all go through it. No, we don't all go through it. We all have bad days. We all have sadness in our life. We all have things that we're anxious about. But those are not mental illnesses. Those are inevitabilities in life. I talk about my dad died in January. That makes me sad, but it doesn't make me depressed. So I think part of this is educating people who just don't understand. I mean, the biggest audience that's out there for a talk like I would give would be caregivers, people that care about someone, a partner, a parent, a brother, sister, an employer. Those are the people that need to understand that they don't understand. Like, depression is one of the few things that we believe we get it, right? I call it the arrogance of the healthy brain. We believe somehow that we have experienced bad times in our life, but we have been able to overcome them. Whereas me, Landsberg, that guy, he had to go to the doctor, he had to go on medication, he talks that he has a sickness. I am strong and he is weak. And that, to me, is what the caregiver, if you want to be of use to the person you care about, you need to acknowledge the fact that you actually don't understand it. I mean, I would never, like, for instance, my depression is monodepression, right? I'm not bipolar. Although when I get really energetic, people think, oh my God, I think he's manic. But I'm not. But I would say, John, that I have never experienced mania. So for me to explain, like the mania part of bipolar is damaging to people because They lose their better judgment. They do things. They take risks. They have behaviors that are totally not typical for them. But I can't understand that. Like, I can't understand why, if you wanted to be faithful to your wife, why you would go out and cheat on your wife because you have this thing called mania. I'm not saying it's not valid at all. I'm saying I can't understand it. And I say the same thing to people who think they can understand depression but haven't been through it. You can't understand it. I can't understand schizophrenia. I can't understand what it's like to have, like these voices in my head telling me to do certain things. So I think that that's kind of at the heart of how do we become better caregivers, and that's understanding that you don't understand.
Man, it's so true, because people think that they understand things that they don't, and like you said, the almost like the arrogance or the ignorance of it is almost like off the charts sometimes. But they don't understand, but they think they understand. That's like the worst.
Yeah, that is. But I'm not suggesting at all that I was any different before I felt depression. I like when I first got hit by it, like it was probably by the time I sort of declared myself screwed in the head by depression, it took me 8 months, right? So let's say 1998. I wanted to go around and apologize to everybody that I had ever judged. I never said anything to anyone. I never said, "Oh, you're weak," or, "Suck it up," or "What do you have to be depressed about?" But I thought those things. And then the first time I realized that was what I was experiencing, it floored me. It was 1,000 times worse than I ever imagined. I had no control over my ability to experience joy. It was like no matter what I did, nothing felt right. Nothing felt good. Nothing tasted good. Nothing smelled good. Nothing was good. And I could never understand that until the moment when I understood it.
Man, just like thinking of you, so like calm, cool, collected, your interviews, and just thinking about it, you wouldn't think like, not that, oh, you had something bad, but you wouldn't think like, wow, like you wouldn't, like, you know what I mean? Like you weren't in
Oh,
full
yeah.
control, because your interviews, you're in like full control, no matter who you had on. It was amazing.
John, thanks for saying that. And you're 100% correct. And that's one of the reasons why I think I'm well suited for this, because I'm the opposite of what you would perceive as someone with depression. And that is proof of a few things. Number one, that it can hit any of us. But number two, that we can wear the mask. Somebody with depression, I tragically heard about, I think someone responded to something I did on TikTok this morning. And they said that they lost a brother, I think 10 years ago, to suicide. And the point was, she said, I didn't know anything. My parents didn't know anything. No one had any clue. My brother showed no signs whatsoever of depression. And then we found out afterwards that he actually, was depressed enough to take his own life. But that's an example of just how good we can be at wearing the mask. I can fool people into thinking I'm okay when I'm really not.
Because I, for this show, obviously we do a lot of wrestling stuff, and that's how I kind of came across you doing the wrestling interviews. And Vince McMahon, I mean, there's nobody that like wouldn't get intimidated by him. But then I see you interviewing him a few times. I'm like, man, this guy is like, he is like in control. No matter if Vince always thinks he's in control, like you were in control of the interview. So that was like when you first, I mean, God, 1998 came on my radar really, because I was like, wow, this guy did an awesome interview with Vince McMahon, and not intimidated, didn't back down. Like you were in full control. So it seemed,
Yeah, no, I think I was. And also, there were different times when I was feeling okay from my depression, because like in 1998, I went on medication and was on for about 2 years, then went off, and I was fine for a year. Then I relapsed. I did that cycle 4 times. The last time asked me to explain what this tattoo is, and it relates to that story. But so there were times when I felt pretty good. And the job that I did, you see, no one ever said to me after a show, well, that wasn't your best. But in my mind, it wasn't my best. In my mind, because we listen to ourselves way more closely than anybody else listens to us, right? You hear, as a broadcaster, you hear every syllable, every sound that comes out of your mouth. As an actor, you would do the same thing. You would be judging how you delivered a line. So no one said to me, are you okay? Like, not once, not one time. But in my mind, I was awful. And that gets to one of the worst things about mental illness is the loss of self-esteem. You know, you can take a person who has what I've been accused of, a cocky strut, and I can still look like I got the cocky strut, but I won't feel that confidence that that I was gifted, I think, from my parents in a lot of ways, who just believed in everything I did. So I think probably some shows I was feeling okay, and some shows I was just acting. And you're right about Vince, but Vince gave me the confidence, I think, to do that job for the next 17, 18 years, because I felt like we were in the makeup room. He was in the makeup chair, and I was standing behind him, talking to him, looking in the mirror. And he said something, and I said something sort of typical Landsberg, smartass comment or whatever. And he kind of gave me a look like, yeah, maybe you beat me on that or whatever. And I thought, oh my God, I just stood up to Vince McMahon. I can do this. And then we went and did the show. And I think that was the Bret Hart screw job show, where he said, I didn't lie to Bret. And I said, well, I don't understand. He said, well, I didn't lie. I said, yeah, but you said that you decided in advance it was going to be a draw. And then all of a sudden, you got them to ring the bell, and it was not a draw. So how is that not a lie? He said, well, I didn't lie. I said, well, no, it doesn't make any sense. And I just remember sort of pausing, and he went, yeah, okay, I lied in that case, but I couldn't let him leave with the belt or whatever. So that gave me the confidence to do the next interview with somebody who, in theory, I should be intimidated by. But here's the scariest thing about the job, or the most vulnerable you are, is that you are now having a debate. You are now arguing potentially with somebody about their life and their world. So here, I'm talking to Vince about wrestling and and things that he's done, and WWF at the time, and but that's not my world. So I got to be pretty confident that I can go with him and debate things with him, knowing that I don't live in that world.
That's one of those things that I don't know if a lot of people would be able to do what you did. You know what I mean? Like, no, like they might say, "Oh, all right, we'll move on," but you were like, "No, you're lying. Like, it's not true. Like, you lied." Yeah.
Yeah, but that was also, that was I don't know if I could say I was trained for it. I mean, I worked as I was obsessed with becoming a broadcaster on television, a sports broadcaster. So I, in a lot of ways, everything I had done before Off the Record prepared me for Off the Record. And for some reason, I kind of just fell into this. But it's just the way I normally am, John. If you and I were watching, what's your favorite sport outside of wrestling?
Football.
Okay, and who's your team?
Giants, New York Giants.
Okay. So if you made a comment about the New York Giants, I would challenge you on that comment, even if I didn't agree with it, just for fun, right? And we would go back and forth, because that's what sports fans do, right? You debate. It's no fun to sit with people that agree with you all the time. And I was always like that when it came to sports. So now I kind of think I'm suited to the role of asking questions and kind of demanding answers, because that's just the way I am.
Got to get back to Vince in a second, but I want to ask you about that tattoo. What does it mean? Why did you get it? When did you get it? What is it?
It says 11/24/08 YUL MH5210400. 11/24/08, November the 24th, 2008. YUL is the Montreal airport code. MH521 is Marriott Hotel Room 521. 0400 is 4 a.m. in the morning. We were in Montreal shooting Off the Record, and I had gone through the previous year, which was my worst depression ever. Anxiety through the roof. And I was sitting on the edge of my bed, and I thought, wow, I know why people take their own lives. And I wasn't a danger to myself, because I'd been through it before. As I told you, I had been on medication, then went off and relapsed. And I was always hesitant to go back on, thinking, I don't need it this time. But I needed it that time. And I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought, this is why people take their own lives. Because when you can't feel anything but pain, there's not much incentive to get out of bed. There's not much incentive, to go on with your life. And the only way for some people to perceive the end of the pain is the end of their life. And the only way to combat that is to try to find a way to give them hope that tomorrow could be better than today. That's the only way that you can convince someone that taking their own life is the wrong thing to do, because they will tell you, I want to end my pain. And unless you can suggest to them a way that they can end their pain without ending their life, it's a really tough battle to face.
When that is going on in your head, were you thinking the worst?
No,
Okay.
but I knew, like, if you would have said to me, hey, Michael, what you're feeling now and what you have felt for the last year is going to be with you forever. We can't do anything for you. I would have been a danger to myself then. Not that night necessarily, but I couldn't have gone on, indefinitely. And it's proof that you can love your wife, you can love your kids, you can love your parents, you can love your job, you can love all of these things, but that doesn't lessen the pain, and it doesn't lessen the fear that the pain will still be with me tomorrow. People will often say, well, not to me, but to, someone who attempts to take their own life, how could you do that? Look at all the great things you have to live for. But those things don't register. And we all have a voice in our head with depression that tells us the things that we least want to hear. I mean, imagine, you have 2 kids. Imagine believing in your head, John, just think about this, that you are convinced that your kids would be better off if you took your own life. Imagine that. Like, that's the most absurd thing in the world. What kid ever did well for the rest of his life because his parent took his or her own life? It's absurd. Nothing could be more crushing or devastating. Yet the illness has the ability to convince us of things because it robs us of our self-esteem. And then we start to sort of percolate these ideas in our head that, okay, my kids would be better off without me. And I have spoken to people who attempted suicide and, thankfully did not complete suicide. And I said, well, what were you thinking? How did you deal in your mind with these people that love you? And the explanation is, I thought, and I've heard this a million times, I thought that, my kids would be sad for a little while, but they'll be better off without me.
Scary thought, because I've had family members that tried, thank God, survived, but said the same thing. But their children, I think, would have been way worse off, without. You know what I mean? Like, it's the exact opposite of what they think at the
Totally.
time.
Yeah. And that's the same voice that I would hear. It's the voice of depression. It's not like a voice like you hear, like with schizophrenia, you may hear a voice or you would hear voices. It's these thoughts that come into your head that it's like your worst enemy got a list of all the things you don't want to hear, all the things that you felt vulnerable about, all of the fears that you had. And then that enemy repeats them to you over and over again. You're not good enough. You're not good at your job. You're not a good father. You're not a good husband. All of these things that we don't want to hear, we do hear. And the only way to get rid of the voice in your head is to treat the illness. And fortunately for me, there was a treatment for me that worked. Not everyone gets help. Most people do get help. Most people, if you stick with it, will get improvement. I'm not cured. I'm still on medication. I still have bad days, but my bad days aren't terrible days. So I think that word hope becomes the most important word in the mental health dictionary.
For sure. And those people that, that they think that they're better off or they think their family's going to be better off, they're definitely 100% wrong, because the family will then live with that for the rest of their lives. So their life will even be infinitely worse than it was before, for sure.
You know what it is, John? It's like, okay, how poignant can depression be with us? And the answer is, can you imagine? It can be so hard on us. It can deceive us so much that a parent would think that their kid would be better off without them, better off with them dead, better off with them having ended their own life. That's the power of the illness that is staggering for someone who's never been through it to understand.
Yeah, it's just crazy, like, to think about stuff like that. Absolutely. So that tattoo, like has meaning to you as
Yes.
far as when you look at it, that's where you.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly use it because I spend my time doing what I'm doing now with you, and that's talking about mental health and trying to make a difference in somebody else's life because someone understands them. The power of feeling like you're understood is you can't you have no idea how important it is for someone to go, oh my gosh, someone understands me. So this represents, a bit of my story. It represents a conversation item that I can use to talk about suicide. It shows people that I understand sort of the depth of real pain. So it's kind of a prop for me to some extent to try to connect with people in a way that sometimes can be very difficult to connect with.
I just got to go back to Vince McMahon just for a
Yeah.
minute because I'm so fascinated just about that because of how great you were with him a few times when you had him on. But how do you get him on to begin with? Because that doesn't
Okay.
seem like an easy thing to do or an easy guy to get on. Because I know Off the Record is a big show, but it's like, how do you even go about getting him on a few times?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, Off the Record became a big show because of wrestling. It's pretty easy to explain, and no credit to any of us before we ended up doing these interviews. TSN, where I worked, created this show. TSN also owned the rights to Raw and Nitro. Raw was on every Monday night and then replayed at 4 o'clock the next afternoon. Our show was on 6 o'clock after it. And so there was a partnership between TSN and WWE. Same thing for WCW, but they weren't nearly as interested in doing what we did with WWE or WWF at the time. And the first week we were on the air, we had a 3-guest panel, which because we didn't talk about doing one-on-one interviews, right? It was going to be a panel discussion, kind of like. It would have been politically incorrect. I don't know if you remember that show. Bill Maher did it.
Oh, yeah.
And what I loved about the show was the fact that he had people from all walks of life debating something that kind of united them. Like no one was an expert necessarily in the subject. They just had opinions. And that's what we tried to create. So management wouldn't let us have 4 guests to start with. It was only 3. So we did this panel on the Thursday of our first week. And Bret Hart was a guest. I don't know how we booked Bret Hart. I don't know. I just don't remember. And he came up to me after the show and said, Michael, I thought it was a pretty good show, but you don't need anybody else when I'm on. Put me on. Let me talk. And it was like, okay, yeah, we'll do that. And then Survivor Series kind of all happened. And he was looking for an outlet that would treat him with respect. The reason why wrestlers came to us and the reason why we had such a good relationship was we treated them with respect. It wasn't like, Bob Costas had this terrible interview with Vince McMahon. And I think Vince was, and I love Bob Costas, but Vince was pissed off that he was being treated kind of like a sideshow. And, we had no interest whatsoever in having guests on in character, right? Like, why, imagine talking to The Rock when The Rock is talking like The Rock, then I'm just part of the gag, right? But we got Dwayne Johnson instead of The Rock. And it became huge for us to the point where our ratings would quadruple. Like, it was insane how I remember on a holiday Monday, we played the Stone Cold interview. And we drew, I think it was, now keep in mind, Canada is 1/10 the size of America. So everything is kind of 10 to 1. I think we drew 525,000 viewers at 6 o'clock, which would be the equivalent of 5.5 million almost viewers at 6 o'clock in the United States for a cable show that has, kind of niche. It was insane how much, because wrestling audience is portable, right? If you tell, a football fan, hey, you can hear Eli Manning and Peyton Manning, I used Eli because of the Giants, talking about Daniel Jones, people aren't going to go, oh my God, I got to be there, right? Because you can hear and see, those kinds of discussions everywhere. But if you tell a wrestling fan, you will see Stone Cold Steve Austin on Off the Record next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. Wrestling fans are going to come. It's the only portable audience that I have ever found.
the wrestling audience is so loyal too. It's like crazy
Yeah.
loyal, even more so than like some sports fans. I mean, they're just like obsessive, nutty. They love it, especially if it's a big name like a Bret Hart or something, because everybody then starts getting off the record. They get good guests, or they get wrestlers, or they have real interviews with the wrestlers, not a Costas attack piece where he's like literally trying to fight Vince and threatening him, and they're going back. It's like, wow, Michael Landsberg, there's actual good interviews with these guys.
We had this great team. One of the producer of the show was a guy named Bob Makowitz, who became my best friend. One of his friends growing up was a guy named Jeff Merrick. I don't know if you know that name. Jeff Merrick did a show called Live Audio Wrestling. Now he does hockey on Sportsnet. But Jeff was doing live audio wrestling, right? And knew, like his best friends were all wrestlers. He knew, like he could say, okay, we have, or Michael has Chris Jericho on the show next week. Let's discuss some of the inside stuff that's been going on with Chris Jericho, like behind the curtain in the dressing room, the relationship with WWE, all the stuff that we talked about. And Jeff would give me this gold that wrestlers would go, how did you know that? I remember talking to Undertaker, and I said to him, by the way, I loved him. I thought he was a really smart, interesting guy. I said, is it true that backstage, I guess it was Shawn Michaels, he was backstage and he came back after not doing the job for Vince, and you looked at him and said, you get back out there or we got a big problem. Is that true? And he said, yeah, I don't know how you knew that. And I said, so what would you have done if he didn't want to do what you said? And he said, I would have shown him I would have taught him a lesson. I'm sorry, did I say Shawn Michaels?
Yes.
Bret Michaels. Hold on. Bret Michaels is the lead singer of Poison.
Yeah.
Who was a guest on Off the Record one day, by the way.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, well, we did 4,000 shows, and because of the nature of our show, we got to put anybody on, if we thought that a viewer would like to hear what they had to say.
You were right, though. It was Shawn Michaels, yeah.
Yeah, and that was like this amazing experience. We put musicians on, which was like this amazing thing because, we had, tons of famous musicians and actors, and, what a great job that is to be sort of the person stick handling that. So asking those questions was 100% Jeff and Bob, 0% me. Now, I mean, I obviously had to execute it, but I don't take much credit for the quality of those shows and the news that we made because I was gifted those questions.
So were you a wrestling fan with some knowledge or not really?
Yeah, I was a wrestling. I mean, as a kid growing up, I was a wrestling fan. I certainly had probably taken a hiatus from wrestling fandom until Off the Record started, and then it became just really good business, and it became really cool. My son also was very young at the time, and he loved wrestling. He used to say to me, I remember I would come home and I would say, Corey, I got some bad news for you. The Jays game is on TSN tonight, and Wrestle Raw is going to be pushed back to midnight. And he was young, right? He would start screaming and crying, and it was devastating for him. That's the power of wrestling, right? People love wrestling in a way that they don't love many other things in their life, as you said, more so than most sports fans love their sport. NFL football is my favorite thing. NBA basketball would be number 2. But as much as I may love NBA basketball and NFL football, I would say it would pale by comparison to how much wrestlers love, or wrestling fans love, wrestling.
It's great, especially when I was younger. Man, if Hulk Hogan lost, I was pissed. Like when you're younger, of course. Giants lose, like, I kind of expected that. A few years, like you can, but no, not Hogan losing. So yeah, wrestling definitely is different.
Yeah, people. I mean, that's why it remains successful, right? I mean, they just when they do one of the million crowd shots, because the crowd becomes a prop for this or a performer in this. You see the passion that people have. And the belief was that, if people find out that the result is predetermined, they're not going to like it anymore. And then, finally Vince admitted, yeah, I mean, the result is predetermined, and nobody cared. It's kind of like, okay, well, I don't care that this movie that I just saw, or this television show. I mean, I've been watching Better Call Saul. I waited for the series to complete, and I'm watching it now. I don't care that, Saul doesn't exist. It's, like we all want to, we all want to take a break from our lives and embrace something that is make-believe. And I think that's why wrestling works.
Whenever somebody wants to use the F word, fake with wrestling, I would say, have you ever watched anything on TV or a movie?
Yeah, of
It's the
course.
same exact thing
Right.
as all that.
It is, for sure.
With Undertaker, that's just an interesting one because he doesn't, or at that point, he does now, but when you interviewed him, he didn't do a lot of out of character stuff. Like
Never.
he stayed away from that stuff.
He did. And I mean, that was the power of TSN in the partnership with WWE. And it was also the fact that guys wanted to do the show, because the ultimate respect that you can show someone is learning about them and asking them questions that are challenging and interesting. So we kind of got the reputation of, like I remember Kurt Angle when he first did the show. It was like, I think they reached out and said, Kurt wants to do the show. Because there weren't a lot of places that they would be taken seriously, that they would be asked questions that had nothing to do with their characters and everything to do with their background, how they got in the position they were, and how they deal with it.
Did Vince want to do the show, or did you guys want Vince to do the show?
Vince came to us because that was during Survivor Series, and that's when Bret said, called it the screw job, and how Vince lied to him, and like Bret was about as angry as you can be, and I think Vince wanted to have his say, right? And I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I worked Vince over and got him to admit that he lied to Bret. But I'm not fooling myself to think that, I broke him, like he wouldn't have given it up if he didn't think at that point it was the right thing to do. So Vince reached out and said, I want to do the show. And then he, repeatedly actually reached out to us and said, okay, I'm going to be in town. Let's do it. Then when Owen died, he reached out to us and said, I haven't done any interviews, but, I'll do off the record if you guys will come down there. So we went down to Stamford and used their studios to do the interviews, which is weird, right? Because it's like you're on a road game, right? You're in somebody else's home environment, and now you got to interview them about something that is really painful for them and really difficult for them to kind of admit any culpability. So I'm sitting there going, wow, this is really weird. If I was intimidatable at that point, I would have been intimidated. But so we decided when we were down there that because we were getting Vince, that we would do a second show with Vince and Linda, and then we would do a third show with Shane and Stephanie. And so when I was interviewing Vince for the first show, Shane is in the control room, and he's pissed, man. He's yelling at Bob, the producer, who's producing the show from their control room, and he's in my ear, right? And he's saying, "Oh God, Shane's in here. He's pissed off. He's just going to fight you." And it was like, whoa, I didn't say anything because now I'm on the air. He's just telling me that, and it was like he came down like super mad, and Vince said to him, nothing wrong with the questions he asked, he did what he should be doing, and that is pressing me hard. I just thought that was a really sort of cool moment.
Was that like the hardest interview you had to do? Because it is a road game, like you said, but it's Vince, and then there's a huge lawsuit, there's a death involved. I mean, that's got to be tough.
Yeah. As far as I mean, I don't remember exactly what I was thinking, but it was certainly challenging. And again, like the challenge is, are you willing to expose yourself to potential ridicule, right? If I'm asking questions to Vince that he knows 1,000 times more than I know, if I get it wrong, he's going to jump on it, right? He wouldn't have just thought, I don't want to be a dick. I'll just let Landsberg say whatever, like I don't want to correct him. He would have jumped down my throat, because that was the nature of these interviews. So, that remains to this day the biggest challenge about being an interviewer, where you want to challenge guests and you do more than one sport. If all I did was wrestling, then I would have known 1,000 times more. But, we did every sport, including wrestling. So it was like, God, I could have made such a fool of myself saying something that was clearly wrong.
Shane, okay with you later on?
I think so. I met Stephanie a whole bunch of times afterwards, but I don't think I saw Shane after that. After we left that day, but he, like his dad said to him, like, don't be a baby.
Wow. With like the Owen and the Bret stuff, did anybody at that point say, "Oh, he's pro Canada, he's going to defend all the Canadian wrestlers"? Was that ever a thing? Because it seemed like obviously you were agreeing with Bret, but it was almost like Bret was right in a certain aspect.
Right, but I also said to Bret when I interviewed him about Survivor Series and the screw job, I said to him because the key is to take the opposing view. In especially something like sports, right, where you're not hanging your reputation on your opinion on something. Whereas, if you're talking about abortion, then to fight against your own opinion, would be really damaging. But we're talking about wrestling, and my job is to, in that situation, is to get Bret to clarify his position and to fight for his position. And I said, what I don't understand, Bret, is that you're a wrestler. There's a script as to what you're supposed to do. Like Vince gets to decide. He's the boss. And if he decides that you're going to lose, you may not like it, but that's the nature of it. You like an actor, you're Robert De Niro. Are you going to walk off the set because the director told you to do it in a certain way? I would assume you wouldn't do it. And that was my way of remaining impartial, because obviously I challenged Vince the same way that I challenged Bret.
Play a little devil's advocate, I guess you could say.
Totally. That's the job. Like, who wants to hear, an interview with someone where it's, everything is just, yeah, it's a great answer. It's like, that's no fun. That's not my style. And that's what wrestlers really, I think what they appreciated was the fact that they would be challenged and they'd have to use their brains.
My only thing with the Bret stuff is he had partial creative control. So, like, you almost had to acquiesce a little bit to him, but also Vince got caught on tape because of Wrestling with Shadows, the Bret Hart documentary, agreeing to, yes, we're going to do a schmoz. It's going to, it's going to end this way. So, like, he eventually gets caught when that comes out. Like, oh, you lied to him twice. That's like, oh, okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. But also, that's the see Bret, because he was such a star, had in his mind, and as you said, he had some creative control, but he really believed that that others should do what he wanted them to do. Whereas a guy like me, who was, not in his position, but also, I understood the nature of my boss and me, and and how at the end of any debate, I kind of gotta give up on it. I'm not going to say, okay, well, you know what, I don't agree with this. I quit. But Bret had already quit, right? So he was in a position at that point that complicated it, right? Because he was going to WCW, which maybe when he made that decision, he gave up a bit of his creative license. I don't know. It's a fun debate.
To me, it's all Bischoff's fault, because if Bischoff didn't have Medusa throw the woman's title in the garbage, it wouldn't be on Vince's radar that he's going to take the title and throw in the garbage.
True.
Partially.
So
you know what I mean? It's partially his fault.
Yeah, Eric was one of the guys that wanted to come on the show, and he walked in, and it was so obvious. He's going, you're not going to take me down, Landsberg. I'm smarter than you. I'm this, I'm that. And so he came in like with guns a-blazing, which I thought was awesome. Because, when you're the host of a show and you have a really good debate with someone and you lose that debate, you still win, right? Because it's good TV. Which is ultimately the only job, check your ego and don't have to win every argument if they are entertaining arguments. And he said to me, they were talking about the Monday Night Wars, and I guess they had won for a certain amount of time. And he said, I said, well, ebbs and flows. I don't remember how I said it, but, like you guys will lose the wars eventually. And he said, no way. And I said, okay, well, let's bet. And he said, well, I'll come back here and I'll give you $50 if we ever lose. the Monday Night Wars again. And it didn't take long, actually, for everything to turn.
It's funny. It's like 83 weeks of dominance is what they refer to as 83 weeks. He actually has a podcast about it and does shows and everything else. So that's what they call it. It's actually really like 90 weeks if you really delve into it further. And it was 104 out of 117 weeks. So it's like they were dominating. So I could see his bravado, of course. I mean,
Yeah, but also, don't get me wrong. I think that Eric is a super smart guy. I find him to be likable now. I've interviewed him a couple of times since then, not about wrestling, but about whatever he was doing at the time. I think his show is great. I'm a big fan of his. But he, he came in with this really, really cocky swagger. I shouldn't be one to talk, but I thought, okay, well, I got to stand up to him, and if I lose this, who cares? Because I win because the show's good.
I just love looking back at some of the interviews because man, you had Bischoff, Vince is like the tippy top, Austin tippy top, Hogan tippy top, even Chris Benoit. I know some people might not like him now, obviously, and saying it, but if you look at it, it's holy shit, Chris Benoit, Bret Hart, man, the pick of the litter of the best ever.
Yeah, Chris Benoit was. I found him to be very unusual. I can't sit here and say I thought something was wrong with him. But I found him to be kind of weird, and he kept calling me Mr. Landsberg, and I said, I think we're the same age. Why are you calling me Mr. Landsberg? And he said, because you deserve my respect. I said, well, you deserve my respect, but I'm not calling you Mr. Benoit. And there was something about him that I found to be not frightening at all. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a second that I knew that that he was in a lot of trouble. But the last time he was on the show, we were talking about Eddie Guerrero, who I guess was one of his best friends, and
Yep.
we're talking about how he said, well, Eddie became addicted to substances or alcohol. I don't remember what it was, and kind of blamed it on wrestling. And he said that's BS. It wrestling doesn't do that to you. And subsequent to that, obviously, we know that Chris died, and in the worst, most unimaginable way. And when I think back to how he was very defensive for wrestling, I find that to be tragically ironic, right? Because I don't know how much wrestling played in his ultimate demise and his mental illness, which ended up obviously in a terrible way. But I would say that there was a relationship between the drugs that he took, the blows that he took to the head, the fact that you couldn't say, I don't think I'm good, I think I need help. And I think in Chris's case, I don't think he could imagine his life without wrestling. That was it. So there was nothing he was going to do that was going to compromise his position. So I just found it when I went back and watched recently the Benoit interview when he talked about Guerrero. I thought, wow, if we could have only looked in the future, he may have seen it in a different way.
Definitely. I know he's had, I don't even know how many documented concussions, but I think they said it was 50 documented concussions. Who knows how many undocumented? They were saying that when they studied his brain, it was an 80-something-year-old. Who knows what was going on? But he obviously never got the help he needs to get, obviously.
No, and that's the difficult position that he was in, right? Because, like I said, if wrestling is everything to you, then the idea that you may do something that would compromise how you're seen and the chances that you get. If he came out and said, I'm not well, and his greatest fear would be that people would find out that obviously he was incredibly messed up, incredibly sick, and affected by all the things that we talked about. I'm sure he would fear that he would be prevented from wrestling. I mean, I don't know if you were watching the Dolphins-Bills game last weekend, but when Tua came back after what looked to be a concussion, you might say, well, why would a guy come back in a game? And you can't ever give a football player, a hockey player, contact sports stuff, or a wrestler control over whether or not they participate. because almost always they will want to suck it up and go back. In Tua's case, he wanted to beat the Buffalo Bills. In Chris's case, he wanted to continue to be a WWE superstar.
And the Tua thing was weird because you could tell he was concussed, but then they said he had a back injury. I was like, that made no sense.
Yeah,
And they're still saying he has a back injury. I'm like, what?
Yeah. Well, when you lie, you gotta stay with the lie. I mean, the NFL is never really. The NFL has this problem that their sport causes brain damage, right? I mean, no matter what you do, you can't get around that, and it's they can't say that. Football causes brain damage, but watch a game. Watch hits to the head. That aren't necessarily intentional. So, the league has to find a way to minimize what people say about them when it comes to concussions, and they need to keep people on the field, right? Like quarterback in a big game like that, big marquee matchup, Bills and Dolphins rejuvenated, first time they played decent in years. They want the starting quarterback for the Dolphins to be in there.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, yeah. I know they're pumping up the helmets and I don't know, when there's head hitting the ground or head-to-head combat, the helmets can only do so much.
It's true. And I mean, the helmet, unfortunately, I think it wasn't until Jack Tatum, who was a safety for the Raiders, when he realized that his helmet was a weapon. And that he could use it to destroy the opposition. And unfortunately, he did destroy one player's life, and it became then in vogue. I mean, it was looked at as a good hit, right? Wow, he just nailed him. He stuck his helmet right in the other guy's face, into his helmet. That was looked at as a good hit. And then one day, someone realized, okay, well, these blows to the head. We're finding that people, when they turn 40 or 45, these guys are not in good health. And then the whole CTE thing came about, which was, I guess it may have started in wrestling. It was, what was his name? He actually wrestled for a short period of time.
Chris Nowinski.
Chris, yeah. And Chris did off the record probably 15 times because it was such a relevant question for us. But it wasn't until, people stepped back and said, well, do you know what you're doing to people? You can't just say, oh, he got his bell wrong. How many fingers? 2? Okay, get back out there. Even though that still probably does happen, it's really frightening.
Yeah, so T. Higgins in the Jets game, they brought him back in too. I was like, man, his eyes were completely glazed over. That was a bad one.
Do you remember a quarterback named Chris Miller? He played for a million teams.
Falcons, Rams, I think. Yep.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I guess he was mostly a Falcon. And at the end of his career, a veteran quarterback is still in demand, right? To have as a backup, right? Who's not going to demand much money. And that, he's going to learn the system and he'll be able to, implement the game plan, whatever it is. May not be able to execute it the same way. Chris Miller kept getting jobs, and guys that played with him at the end said that he would come back to the huddle and he would talk like he's on the wrong team, like he would be calling Rams plays for the Falcons, and guys would say, no, that doesn't exist. We don't know what that terminology is, and he would go, oh, wow, oh my God, because he was a veteran quarterback. And no one really cared whether or not they were using up the brain cells that he would need the rest of his life to live a normal life.
Yeah. Sad state of affairs. I mean, it's a rough sport, and obviously they got to – I don't know what you could do about it. I know you can help the helmets, but concussion protocol and everything else, that's a tough, slippery slope.
It is for sure.
So as we hit the wind down here, we head towards the finish. Just give me a couple of your all-time favorite interviews. Doesn't matter wrestling or not, but
let's keep it to wrestling.
All right, sure.
I told you Undertaker, although he was Mark Calloway. CM Punk, who just absolutely, I don't know if you saw it, but it was an example of what is. Sorry, I'm just looking. I have to pick up my dog, so that's why I was distracted. But you are more important than my dog. Okay, that was a lie. You're not. So CM Punk was a guest on Off the Record when he left WWE to go to UFC, and so it was that transition point, and he was doing media I guess, talking about, his, signing with UFC. And he was in a studio in New York. I'm in Toronto, obviously. I can see him, he can't see me, and we're just talking, right? I said, I don't know if you know anything about me, right? Like, why would he? And never assume someone does. And he said, oh, no, I know, like, about your wrestling interviews or whatever. And we started talking, and, just kind of friendly. And then the show started. And I guess, according to him, that I totally changed on him, that I set him up by being so nice beforehand. My first question to him was, I'm really interested in this because you leave wrestling, an incredibly dangerous sport when it comes to injuries, but it's a different kind of danger. Guys aren't trying to hurt you. They're actually trying not to hurt you. And unfortunately, that gets away. So I understand the danger of the sport. But I have to ask you, have you ever taken like a real punch to the head? And he said, what? And I said, well, like a real punch. I mean, he said, never seen any of my matches? I go, yeah, I know. And I like your matches. And I think you're amazing. But those are not real punches like you will take in the UFC where, if you expose your chin, someone is going to hit it hard and keep hitting it hard until you either go down or the ref jumps in. And he was like pissed off at that, like right from the get-go, and started to, I said, what's the problem? Like later on in the interview, and he said, well, nothing. You got your way. All of a sudden, like you're the cool kid in school, and I got you, buddy. I got you. And I didn't really get mad because I thought it was really good TV, but I didn't like the way he was kind of condescending to me. And I said that to him, and it kind of became legendary. CM Punk and Landsberg. For me, it wasn't legendary for him. I'm sure he, not significant for him, but for me it was.
Anybody else stick out? Maybe Bret or Vince or?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. Bret and Vince, Jericho. We let Jericho actually host Off the Record a few times because it was funny because he sits down the first time. And he goes, and I think I was a guest on the show. So there was 4 guests and Jericho. We were doing like a panel show, and he starts to talk, and he was nervous, which is natural, right? When you're out of context, when you're kind of doing something totally different, and that everyone expects you to be amazing. And he goes, where's that tape? The monkeys in the truck can't get it straight. And I said to him, I've done this show probably at that point. It was probably our 5th year. So I had done 1,000 shows. I go, I've done 1,000 shows, Chris, and I never once criticized people in the truck or people behind the scenes. And it took you exactly 2 minutes to do it. And we laughed about that. And Chris Jericho is a very likable guy, great personality, love the guy, and really enjoyed sort of getting to know him in that context. I'm trying to think of. I love Trish. Trish actually got her start on Off the Record. We were looking for a woman to put on the show when TSN had signed a new deal with WWE, and they sent down Owen Hart and Edge, and I'm not sure who the other person was, and we wanted a woman on the show. And I reached out to a magazine called Oxygen, which is, I guess, a woman's health magazine, and said, can you suggest anyone that you think would fit in well, wouldn't be intimidated, and knows wrestling? And she said, well, I know this one person. She talks all the time, Trish Stratus. So I called Trish on the phone, which I typically didn't do because other people, booked the show. Right. And I said, how would you like to do this? And she said, I'm in. And this is my chance to show the WWF at the time, I guess it was, that I can be really good, and I'm going to parlay this into a career. And it was like, oh my God, like she said it and she did it. I think, she gets full credit. Like if you asked her, well, how'd you get your start? She would say on Off the Record. But we didn't, she was the one that, that gave this great performance. She was the one that had, the guts to reach out to Vince McMahon. And I have total appreciation for her.
And she hasn't aged a day since.
She has not. Now, could we do a part 2 to this sometime? Because I'm really enjoying it.
Yep. Definitely going to do part 2. Before we let you go, tell us where we can find you and Sick Nut Week and everything else.
Well, my address is 457. Oh, no, when you say find me,
Social media wise, yeah.
yeah, we have a website, sicknotweek.com. I'm on Twitter every day at Hey Landsberg and at sicknotweek, all forms of social media. And hey, if you, I'm not selling anything except for me, right? If you think, hey, you got a company and people could use to hear this talk, tell me to talk to your company. I'll do it.
Awesome. Well, Michael, thank you so much for all time. Really appreciate it. We'll have you back for part 2.
Yeah, loved it. Thanks, man. Great questions. Really appreciated your thoughtfulness.